Okay, thank you for joining us today, and Susan, thank you not only for a great introduction, but also for helping us monitor the chat box and everything throughout the presentation today. I'm Chris Lugo-Grolick of the Justice Research and Statistics Association, and I'm here with Meg Garvin from the National Crime Victim Law Institute. We want to start off by thanking the National Institute of Justice for funding this, generously funding the project and this work that we're going to present to you today. Okay, Meg, did you want to introduce yourself real quick?
You bet. Hello, everyone. Really glad to be here. My name is Meg Garvin. I am the Executive Director of the National Crime Victim Law Institute, as well as a clinical professor of law at Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. NCBLI was really excited and continues to be excited to partner on this project. The idea of figuring out what effectiveness means in legal services and whether we are having impact and the desired impact for survivors that we hope for is something that, as a legal service provider, we've always been hungry for. And so this project gave us the chance not just to quickly put in place evaluation tools that we weren't even sure would be pointing us in the right direction, but instead to hit the pause button and really think about it and think what constitutes success in legal services across a broad spectrum of survivor needs. And so as the director of NCBLI that works on legal services for victims across the country and partners with others, this is just a really great project. And we're still at the front end in many ways, but this conceptual model that we're going to talk about today is going to give us better footing moving forward. So very excited to be here today and talk about the model and to continue to think forward with all of you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Meg. And we are equally excited to be here with you as well, because these research practitioner partnerships are always the most exciting way to go about this work, in my opinion. So when we really started to step back, as Meg was saying, to think about how are we defining success to even start to do an evaluation of victim legal services, we articulated these three research questions to guide the work that we were doing, which is first, how can effectiveness of legal services for victims of crime be defined? What are the inputs, activities, and outputs and outcomes? What should be measured to evaluate that effectiveness? So how do you turn those concepts into practice? And then what systems and data need to be in place to do that type of an evaluation? So we're going to start with just a couple of definitions first. First is, what is a conceptual model? Because that's really kind of a nebulous term. And what in a simpler definition for it is that it illustrates the pathways to achieving program outcomes. It starts with the activities, move to the short-term outcomes that you expect to see fairly soon, and then the longer-term impacts that you expect to see over time. So the conceptual model illustrates the pathways, and the theory of change behind that explains how the program activities are expected to produce those outcomes. So the goal of this work is to develop a unified conceptual model and theory of change for success, for what constitutes success in the delivery of legal services to victims of crime. So the questions that we were thinking about when we were trying to put this together was, first, what story are you trying to tell? When you're trying to put together an evaluation or you're trying to put together a funding application, what is the story that you want interested people to understand about what you're doing? And second, what are your goals with the services? How are you getting there, and how do you measure your work? Meg, I just wanted to toss it to you quickly here to just talk about why this is so important in legal services.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I would love it if folks use the chat right now, any of the legal service providers on the line in particular, and try to answer those two questions that Chris was talking about, right? What story are we trying to tell, and what are your goals, and how do you get there? And I'm going to share the why this matters, I think, in victim legal services from my grounded perspective, right, in victims' rights enforcement. So I've been doing this work since 2003, and I think I shared this story with Susan Howley, who launched this webinar today, and maybe with others. But, you know, I have the total faith that legal services for survivors help them on their trajectory from victim to survivor to thriver, so long as they're trauma-informed legal services. I have the utter faith in that. I believe in our justice systems, right? I have utter faith that if we use them well, we can help. And yet I have very little data that I can point to say that I, as a lawyer, are a useful tool in victim services, right? There's very little there. And I often use I resort to anecdotes, right? I have a couple of survivor stories that I talk about where a survivor said, thank you to me, right? And thank you sometimes when the outcome of the case was not what they wanted. I often talk about one survivor who was one of my very first clients who had a sexual assault case back in 2005. And the case ended up in an acquittal, but the survivor still said thank you because we had fought for her right to be present during the proceedings. And I often cite to that and talk about how meaningful that was. And yet, right, and it was meaningful, and it is meaningful, and it does drive me every day. And yet, an anecdote doesn't always create buy-in in community that legal services are a useful tool. It doesn't create buy-in at a funder level that legal services are a useful tool. It doesn't help us model out how many lawyers we need helping survivors across the state. I see some of the folks who are on, and I know some of the legal services that they do, and right, we're always trying to say legal services are useful, whether it's in housing, in immigration, in divorce and family law, in victims' rights enforcement. A conceptual model that helps us start to evaluate in ways that we can capture and then share a coherent story that is anecdote plus is really phenomenal. And so part of why this matters on a very selfish level is so that I don't have to just have faith that the work we're doing has an impact and a positive impact, but instead I can point to outcomes that we were hoping for and long-term impacts that show and are evidence of the positive impact that lawyers can have for survivors. So really, really excited and also nervous, right? Because my faith is about to be tested if we put the conceptual model in play. But that's a good thing, right? I put in the chat box, I've been doing the work since 2003, and it would be really nice to have evidence of impact.
Okay, great. I did want to actually just ask a couple of questions. So these will be yes or no questions where you can use the green checkbox for yes or the red X for no to reply, and then enter any comments you want to in the chat box. So the first question is, if your organization has its services evaluated, have you used a conceptual model, logic model, or theory change to guide that work in the past? Feel free to go ahead and seeing a lot of red X. Oh, there's a yes from Jennifer Yoder. Hi, Jennifer. Let's see. I'm seeing a few green checks, but I'm seeing a lot of red X's, which I think highlights some of the need possibly that Meg was just talking about. For those of you who did say yes to that question, did you find it useful? Okay. I just realized I was supposed to click something that cleared that between the first question and the second question. So I'll ask the second question there again. Okay, we've got one green check there with a yes, found it useful. And a few other ones too, so that's great. For the benefit of others, feel free to share in the chat box reasons why you did or did not find it useful, because I'm sure others would be interested for sure. From here, we're going to jump into just the methodology behind how we developed this conceptual model. It was an iterative, collaborative process where we involved input from subject matter experts, both people working in the field and survivors that have received services at all stages of the project. We started by interviewing several subject matter experts who we'll show you a bit more about on the next slide. And then from there, we took that information in a review of the literature to do the first draft of the conceptual model. Those subject matter experts who became our advisory board helped us recruit a larger sample of people to survey and get their input on that first draft of the model before we did another revision, and then presented that back to an in-person roundtable with the same subject matter experts that we interviewed before we finalized it, and then began taking it to 3 sites where we are pilot testing it to see what data collection would look like, and we'll talk more about that later as well. So you can see from here that we had a wide variety of people from all different types of legal services agencies, plus 3 crime survivors who were on our advisory board. And Meg is going to talk a bit more about the work that we did with this group.
Yeah, one of the things I want to break down a little bit about some of the legal services. There's a history of legal services in this country, and a lot of legal services for victims were embedded in nonprofit organizations and NGOs that didn't necessarily always identify that the work they were doing was serving victims, right? So we certainly know that legal aid for decades has served lower socioeconomic persons in the country, many of whom are victims, but the criteria for legal services was not victim status, it was poverty and intersection with programming, so housing, immigration, family law. We also have groups that have popped up to do legal services where the criteria is the victim status, right? So we have many really amazing, particularly sexual violence organizations that do national work on legal services as well as local work on legal services for a population, and they do civil, and sometimes they'll do some victims' rights enforcement in the criminal, and they do a plethora of the civil and administrative, right? We also have then victims' rights groups that work predominantly in criminal justice to ensure victims' rights are protected there. Then we'll have pots of folks doing immigration law, right, where sometimes the clients are victims, sometimes they aren't. I'm giving you that background because when we look to see what are legal services for victims, we have to look both at what is self-identified by an agency as a victim population being served, and then also when they're doing legal services, but the population is victims, but that's not the criteria. This advisory group tried to bring together folks who were aware they were doing legal services for victims, but maybe didn't always have a strict criteria that that's all they did, right? So wanted to flag that because that's really important to creating a conceptual model that actually factors the breadth of legal services that survivors need. What we know is in the aftermath of victimization, survivors have to navigate or may have to navigate a lot of legal services, right? A lot of systems, criminal, administrative, civil, and legal service providers are often in each of those, and we'll talk more about that later. The advisory board members represent folks who work in a variety of justice systems doing a variety of legal work. We have folks in here who work in victims' rights enforcement, again, predominantly in criminal. We have folks who are traditional legal aid who do a breadth of work in the civil justice system, as well as have started to do a little bit in rights enforcement. We have immigration lawyers in the mix. We have civil lawyers, tort lawyers in the mix. It was a broad group of folks. Some do benefits work, all coming together. And so it made for robust conversation on the slide that Chris had up just a second ago when we come together and say, what are the activities you do for victims, even reaching consensus on what those are is hard, right? Because we do different things in different systems based on survivors' needs. Figuring out what are shared outcomes or visions. Those are hard because each legal system is different. I say hard, but in a good way. This was robust conversation trying to figure out what is the universe of legal services for survivors, so then we can build a model that transcends or goes across all of those, and then it could be deployed differently. So this advisory board met in a roundtable. First, there were interviews conducted, as Chris noted. Then there was a roundtable discussion had. Lots of themes emerged from that. Some of the key ones were no matter where you are, right, as a lawyer, your job is to do what the survivor says. So victim-led legal services, right, which is an ethical foundation of our work. Figuring out, triaging what clients need, making sure that you're responding to what they need, not necessarily what the legal system needs. Figuring out how to reconceptualize success and then how to measure success. Those were the conversations. Again, really robust conversation, and excited to have this amount of folks on, and also grateful that we didn't have more on this phase, but that we were able to get through surveys additional information. So I think I'll leave it there, Chris.
Okay, sounds good. That's a great segue into the meat of the webinar, shall we say, where we present to you the actual conceptual model itself that we developed before getting into different ways that the model could possibly be used. So we created two different versions of the model, one of which is more high level to more good for presenting the logic of how the model will work, and then the fully detailed version of the model, which has just a lot more information in it, and we'll be digging into all of this. And so before we get into that, we just had a few considerations to sort of frame the model a little bit and set it up for you to look at and begin to digest it as we present it. One is that we were talking before about activities, shorter-term outcomes, and longer-term objectives. And so when we were putting the model together, we really thought about outcomes as achievable for individuals and potentially a bit more measurable, whereas the longer-term objectives are ideals that we strive for and what we hope the impact for the community and for legal systems writ large may be. We want to be clear that this particular conceptual model is limited to legal services and does not encompass all of victim services for the purpose that you just have to draw the line somewhere, and legal services is our focus. And as Meg was saying, the model is intended to be quite general, but service providers can customize the model for implementation and practice and really just tailor it to your specific needs. So this is the high-level model here where each of these activities listed under the different categories. We've divided activities between criminal and juvenile justice legal systems, civil legal systems, administrative legal systems, and activities that cut across two or more systems. These are just high-level examples here. Then what we show is from activities towards outcomes. We've divided those into three categories as well: victim and survivor outcomes, community level outcomes, which focus really on education and knowledge about victim legal services and resources available, and then system related outcomes, which focus on improvements in victim treatment and victim-centered responses. And so these are a little bit more measurable, perhaps, than the longer-term objectives. The longer-term objectives are also divided into victim and survivor objectives, community objectives, and system objectives. And the hope here is that by consistently achieving the short-term outcomes, that over time these long-term objectives will appear. The logic behind this is theoretically grounded in the procedural justice, conservation of resources, and trauma-informed care perspectives. So we think about procedural justice, particularly given that a legal service provider can't always get a victim the actual case outcome that they want, but do they feel that they were treated fairly and respectfully in the process? We thought a lot about trauma-informed care perspective and thinking about systems outcomes and getting systems to be more responsive to victims' needs and victims' concerns. We will say that coming up with a condensed list of activities was definitely a challenge, especially given variations in legal systems across the states and between states. Something in one state might fall in the administrative category and in another state fall in the civil category, something like that. But what we're interested in having you focus on are the outcomes for victims. So this simpler version of the model is also what's in a 2-page fact sheet that will be available to you at the end of this webinar, and the much more detailed version, which we're going to show you next, is also available on the project page at the JRSA website, and that link will be made available at the end of this webinar as well. So this slightly overwhelming thing here is the fully detailed version of the model. Don't worry about digesting all of this at once. We're going to go through this section by section on the slides that follow. Let's see if you said that. Okay. So as we were mentioning, the organization of this model and the items that are included in each category grew out of the consultative process that we went through with our practitioners throughout this year-long process, which Meg went through in quite detailed. So this is truly a collaborative product with many, many authors. It has the same categories of organization as the simplified model on the previous slide, and the main difference between that one and this one is that this one just has a whole lot more examples under each category. Okay, let's see. One of the important things to remember here as well is that this model is aspirational. In an ideal world with adequate resources available, everybody's got the political will to come together on it. The process for delivering successful legal services for crime victims would theoretically go like this. So we know that the real world does interfere, however, but we wanted to go for the aspirational and the ideal here, knowing that, you know, in real life, it's not going to be perfect, things will fall short, but this is the conceptual framework that we keep in mind, and this is the goals that we strive for. So let me just check a couple things here. Okay, so we also had a bit of a challenge here in, as we mentioned, trying to come up with a condensed list. So you'll see that a number of these are somewhat general. If you're looking at it from the perspective of your particular agency, you may find that some activity or some outcome that is really important to you maybe is not included in the model, but part of the beauty of being able to customize the model is that you can tailor that kind of thing to fit your specific situation. And so think of these lists as intended to be representative but not exhaustive. We're going to go through this section by section as we go through. So another couple of points that we just wanted to point out is that no single agency is expected to provide everything that's listed in this model. When we were going through feedback sessions with various stakeholders on the model, people got really nervous. I'm going to be held accountable for all of this. Oh my gosh, and no, you're not. You'll pick out the parts of the model that apply to what you do, and then think about this as applying to the system writ large, because everybody who works in the system may work on different pieces of this. And another important principle that we had is that underlies the whole model is that services are intended to be accessible and appropriate for different groups of victims, including providing culturally informed services, making services accessible both physically or via access to information to people with English as a second language, individuals who are disabled or elderly, making services welcoming for immigrants, LGBTQ individuals, racial and ethnic minorities, and other different groups who may have specialized victim needs by providing materials in multiple languages, using gender-neutral language, and having a staff that's representative of the population that it serves. So representation includes advocating for victims receiving any additional services and being treated respectfully as defined by their cultural norms. Those were underlying principles that were discussed heavily during our collaborative meetings, but when you're trying to put a model on a single slide, not everything quite fits. But we just wanted to make sure that, to make clear that these were all underlying principles that we thought through. So we're looking at breaking down these sections of the model now, and I'm going to toss it back to Meg to talk about program activities.
Yeah, Chris, before we move on to that slide, could you go back just to the overwhelming slide, the one right before, just for a second, because I want to talk about how I, as a practitioner doing a narrow group of legal service work, right, a narrow pot of work, how we're thinking about using this. And I'll come back to this later, but with this slide up, I just wanted to give this grounding before we dig in. So NCVLI does victims' rights enforcement work. Again, that is a piece of a puzzle of legal services. We partner with others to do other work. So when I'm looking at victims' rights enforcement, predominantly if I'm on the left-hand side here, program activities, it's the first major bullet, right? Criminal and juvenile legal systems. That's predominantly where we are, plus the last bullet, all legal systems. So as a legal service provider, I would be looking at this list of activities and being like, do these fit, right? And trying to figure out, where am I? What we actually are doing at NCVLI is taking this model, and we are starting with the right side, right? Long-term objectives. We're actually starting with the theory of change, right, as we do strategic planning. What's the theory of change we hope for in the world, right? We're seeing where does that fit in those long-term objectives, and then we're aligning with our program activities. But what we're doing is we're in that first bullet and we're in the last bullet. And then we're moving over to the middle column, and which of these outcomes short-term are we hoping for, and which of the long-term are we hoping for, right? And so it's kind of like a menu. So for the practitioners that's how we're using it. It's kind of like a menu to see what fits with our theory of change, right? And then outcomes and objectives and activities. So it really becomes a bit of a menu. So if we move on to the next slide, the menu starts to become clearer of program activities. Which ones are we doing, right? It is, as the slide says, it is incredibly challenging to try to capture everything that lawyers do for their survivor clients. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a lawyer and because I'm like, yeah, we do so much. No, every lawyer deploys their legal advocacy in different ways based on system. Are you in the administrative? Are you in the civil? Are you in the criminal? Based on jurisdiction, right? Can I formally enter my appearance in a case? Do I have to do informal work in a particular way? So when the advisory group came together, what we tried to do, as well as through some of the questions to others across the country, was what is the scope of all the things you do, right? And that became a massive list of things. So we tried to, with the advisory council, categorize them, right? Like what are some of the themes? What are some of the big pieces that we could start having categories? It is very true that in different systems, things, or different jurisdictions, things might fall into different systems. So for instance, here in Oregon, right, the recovery of restitution, the question is that criminal or is that civil? So any of you, like in the chat box, if you were going to recover, actually collect on restitution that was ordered in the criminal case, in your jurisdiction, if you know, is that civil or is that criminal? I'm just curious if anyone in there who's on the line knows. Yeah, right? Civil, criminal, right? It varies. It's like this perfect example of a conceptual model is just that. It is a concept that is a model. So you have to figure out which pieces fit for your jurisdiction, for the legal services, right? And I see someone on who is actually from my jurisdiction who answered the question, right? It's criminal in Oregon predominantly, right? Until you go through other hurdles. So we have categories, we have a schema here in this model, but it, A, doesn't capture everything at this high level. B, it might be in different categories on yours. So we ask that you understand that and start looking at it as a menu with categories that are ideas, that are general themes that may not be a perfect fit in your jurisdiction. And so you're going to have to look through the whole list. Don't just default to criminal, juvenile. Look through it more holistically than that, but know that the categories should be useful as a starting point. And then you start to figure out what are we actually doing, how are we doing it, and as the slide notes, like you report on a lot of these activities already, and so it's just starting to look at the data collection a little differently. So Chris, I'll turn it to you to talk about outcomes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so as mentioned, we came up with 3 different categories of outcomes. We focused probably most heavily on the victim and survivor outcomes, which are probably of most interest to participants on this call for sure. And as mentioned, we wanted to identify outcomes that a program could potentially hold themselves accountable for, even if the victim doesn't achieve the exact result that they wanted in their legal action. So the procedural justice approach here. And as such, these victim outcomes are largely perception-based so that you can ask victims about them after they've received services or even while they're receiving services. So to make them friendly to measure in that way, you can often get many of those from your victim satisfaction survey, although there are a couple of other ones in here related, for example, to having financial and resource losses minimized. Most commonly, providers might have assisted a victim with receiving victim compensation or victim restitution, or they might have helped a victim avoid being evicted from their apartment, or were able to help a victim maintain their employment, things like that. So there are some outcomes that you might capture outside of the survey and just where you keep your records on your cases. These are the outcomes that we heard should be expected as to result from high-quality, trauma-informed legal assistance to victims and survivors, and with the community and system outcomes from outreach and training activities if your agency has the resources to do that. So again, community outcomes focus on education and knowledge, and system outcomes you can see here focus on development of case law, especially precedent and enforcement of victims' rights in other areas, training, improvements in victim-sensitive procedures, and enforcement of victims' rights. And so related to this, we had a few questions that we just wanted to ask you for discussion, 3 to be exact. And I'm going to ask Susan to help me out just a little bit because with my particular view, I can't see the chat. So I'm going to put up questions and ask her to read out some of your answers. So the first question that we'd like to ask you is whether you currently measure any of the victim outcomes already, any participants.
All right, I'm seeing some yeses, a few no's, yeses through surveys, and we've had a couple of expressions of interest in any victim satisfaction surveys that people are willing to share.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, great.
I would say it's about evenly split between people who say yes, no, or in some circumstances.
Okay, great. Of those who said yes, are there any that use a method other than a survey to do that?
One commenter says that they're completing their first community assessment, which may or may not include some reports from victims. And a few people are saying they're doing or considering focus groups.
Excellent, excellent. And lastly, we'd like to ask, one of the ways that we're testing the effectiveness of outreach activities, which gets at some of these community and system outcomes, is to track referrals into legal services agencies that result from that outreach. And we were curious if anyone has tried measuring that, and if so, have they done it another way?
Chris, can you restate that a little more simply? It was hard to follow.
Oh, sure. It's up on the slide as well. Yeah, one way that we're testing the effectiveness of outreach activities, which are the things that would increase community knowledge and would hopefully help with implementing some system changes towards more victim-sensitive procedures. One of the ways that we're testing that is to track referrals to legal services that resulted from that outreach. So if you did a training with a specific prosecutor agency, for example, did the legal services agency get more referrals of new clients from that prosecutor's office, that sort of thing. And so we were curious if anyone else has tried to measure any of these community or system outcomes, and how did you do it?
All right, one person reports they're getting feedback from survivors on their experiences with the referrals that they send out. Another says that if the outreach included an education component like Know Your Rights, they do a pre and post survey to measure the increase in knowledge.
Okay, great. That's wonderful. Yeah, that's one of the things we're really trying to get from here now is now that we've got this conceptual model going is really thinking about, okay, how do we measure these outcomes? And
another interesting, Chris, I'll just report another interesting one that came in. One person is measuring law enforcement's perceptions of the attorneys and victims with attorneys.
Oh, that's interesting. I would love to know more about that. That's fabulous. Let's take note of who that is. We may have questions for you later.
And I want to chime in. A lot of folks mentioned the focus groups, and then there was a little bit of conversation about the challenges with focus groups. So would love folks to continue using the chat to share the strengths and the challenges of focus groups around this work. And then similarly, kind of someone mentioned immediate post in-person interview with the client by someone who wasn't a lawyer. Would love to know more about that too, because those are some of the challenges that I know we, as well as other legal service providers, have noted. Right? How do you capture, at least for the victim survivor outcomes, some of the information in a way that serves them, right? And yet you get good data too, both during and after. And then with regard to the community and outcomes that you guys were just noting, I too would love to know more. I love the pre and post. We try and do pre and post all the time. And so any successes on and challenges on focus groups, on pre and post tests, I think that would be fantastic to add to this model. Thank you.
Yeah, and this chat will be preserved as well, so all of your input is extremely valuable, and we appreciate that certainly. We're just going to move right now into the last section of the model, which is the long-term objectives. These are the aspirational ideal impacts that we strive for from consistently delivering high quality and trauma-informed legal assistance. So this is definitely aspirational. Some of this may be measurable. Others of these long-term objectives may be more difficult to measure. Some of these victim and survivor objectives are a little bit easier to measure in that there are survey scales available for some of them, and so that might be possible to do if there's a long-term follow-up survey and things like that. These community objectives may be measurable in the future via, community attitude surveys, things like that. The system objectives are a little bit more difficult to measure as well, but you can look at just improvements in service delivery, especially if they are institutionalized improvements. And so we'd like to ask you a question. Take a minute. Don't feel like you have to read this all in the next 5 seconds. But just for first impressions, we're curious which of these long-term impacts might be one of your biggest priorities, and do you currently have a way to measure, or have you tried?
Well, folks are thinking about that. I wanted to jump in. This is actually, I think that I saw that there are some other folks who teach law courses on, based on the folks I know in, that I saw on the list. This is an exercise I actually do with my law students, which is what is the long-term objective of A, being a lawyer, B, serving a client, and trying to figure out if they know both how they're thinking about it and then how they could talk to a survivor about it also, or their community, their policymakers. It's actually an exercise I really wish we would start earlier in legal service provision in law schools, because oftentimes we graduate lawyers who are so case-focused that, which we have to be in the moment, but that they don't have the capacity to think longer. And Susan, I'm going to turn it to you because we have a lot of stuff coming in on the chat.
Oh, great.
Yes, we do. And we had a question about how others are dealing with the word empowerment. And this questioner is planning to move away from that word for a variety of reasons, and wonders if there is something that is on other people's radar or better words to use. Another person, one of their priority outcomes is survivors and families integrated into a supportive community. That's right, we've certainly talked about that a lot. The victim and survivor objectives are also a priority for the Victim Connect programs. Legal systems responsiveness to victims, improved health and mental health, responsiveness to victims' needs. Someone has used employment instead of empowerment, which is a possibility. We had a question: how are legal services impacting survivors' ability to achieve their long-term goals, and also secure and safe housing and reducing rates of re or poly traumatization?
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm so excited.
There's a lot of back and forth, folks. We do encourage you to keep using chat. Yeah, and Meg notes that rather than empowerment, her organization uses the term agency.
Mm. Okay, yeah, that's definitely a great option as well. Yeah, definitely keep on going in the chat. We are going to move to the next slide quickly here, which takes the model the next step. We've got this conceptual model. What can you use the model for? So Meg, I'm passing it back to you.
I know, and I'm so engrossed in the chat. I'm sorry, because I can see it, Chris. And I just wish we were all in person and could have a conversation. But I love it, and I love that people are being so dynamic in it.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, one of the hopes is we are at the conceptual model phase, and so many of you have been doing this work also, either as researchers, as practitioners, or many of you wonderfully in some sort of blend. And so we're hoping to hear more from you. The way we're thinking about using the conceptual model and the way the advisory council thought about the conceptual model and where we're moving forward is designing programs based on it, thinking about evaluation, and then being able to tell our story. So one of the things is, where do we want to go to, right? What is the theory of change we're aiming for? That is actually one of the starting points, we believe, of any program design. Before you design your activities, before you design what you're going to evaluate, you have to know where you want to go. And yes, you know, grant solicitations have some of that in there, but often the conceptual model helps you think bigger. What is the change in the world you are hoping for, right? What are the outcomes that you are hoping for and the long-term objectives? With all of that in mind, you then design a program and you build from the front end evaluation in a way that is achievable. One of the things that I know as we're working and moving into the next phase of this is figuring out how you actually can do evaluation and measure things when you have a million other things happening is a challenge. So really thinking about it at the front end so that you know what your desired outcomes are at the front, so that you can set up your systems in place in order to measure your successes and your challenges and your delays. Right, we're all experiencing that right now during COVID. And then taking all of that to be able to tell your story. This is, you know, very selfishly, I'm in that right-hand category. I want to be able to tell the story of the impact of the work and to be okay if the story that ends up coming out of the evaluation says that I'm not doing it right. Right, I'm not achieving the outcomes I want, because then I can revise, I can change, or I can figure out that I'm not the right service for this survivor population. I think that is one of the best things that could come out of this, is both telling our successes and also figuring out if survivors need something else. And I think we all need to be open to that, but being able to tell those stories to stakeholders, whoever they are, is really important. So we're trying to figure out, right, as I've said, I believe that rights enforcement in the criminal situation helps with survivors along the spectrum, and I see the conversation on empowerment is continuing to go forward. Again, we use the word agency because it comes out of feminist history as opposed to autonomy, which comes out of a Western European rational analysis of things, and for some of the same reasons why we don't often use empowerment. And so we believe it enhances agencies. If it turns out it doesn't, then we have a different story to tell, and we probably would be supporting other people's programs. So it's really critical, and this model will help us be much more structured and thoughtful in our process.
Wonderful. And from a more practical what Meg said was definitely practical, but just talking about what we're doing right now, because as Meg was saying, developing this model was only phase one of our project. And so what we're involved with now is what's called a formulative evaluation with 3 victims' rights enforcement clinics. And we spent the year creating this model in order to lay a foundation under the evaluation design that we are pilot testing with each of these 3 sites. So we've taken this basis that we've constructed here for victim legal services generally. We've picked out the pieces of it that apply to the victims' rights enforcement work that's being done by these 3 different clinics. And we've used the model to create evaluation designs that we're pilot testing and to select which outcomes, not only which outcomes we're going to attempt to measure, but also which activities we believe will lead to those outcomes. So it's just provided this wonderful roadmap for us to structure that whole evaluation design that we're pilot testing before we propose launching a full evaluation. So these pilot tests are launching this month and concluding at the end of May, at which time the full evaluation designs that we will propose to NIJ, hopefully, will be revised based on that pilot test and learning the usefulness of the measures that we proposed from the model. How useful are they in real life when they're applied in practice? What is the feasibility and ease of collecting and reporting valid data on those measures? We might have a concept that we think is a fabulous outcome that we should absolutely measure and go after, but it's just not practical in real life to do it based on resource constraints or anything else. So the pilot test affords us the wonderful luxury of finding that kind of information out before we invest in a full evaluation. And then the model will also be revised if necessary after that testing, and we encourage other people to test it out as well. It needs to be field tested, we believe, in a variety of different settings. So that's how we want to take this research into practice. So we have, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to open 4 minutes of that up to discussion right now before we just tell you where you can access more materials on what we presented to you today. So I'm just going to put up the model again so you can see it while we're talking, and just the floor is open for discussion and questions and anything you'd like to say or ask.
Yes, please put in the chat box any additional questions we're looking for. Someone flagged that they want to talk more about evidence-based, but that's another webinar. The empowerment conversation is still going on, which is fantastic. I want to reiterate something that Chris just shared, which is the pilot is a narrow test. And Susan, I think, put it in the side chat also. It is victims' rights enforcement clinics that are being part of the pilot testing, which again means predominantly, if we're looking at this chart, the top bullet with the bottom bullet, and then depending on the clinic, a few in the civil and administrative, right? And so trying to figure out what is common across those, and really what we're trying to figure out is, can things be measured? Can this work? Not how are those clinics doing, right? So, but again, it's going to be a narrow pilot looking at rights enforcement, which is one of the newer areas of legal services in the grand scheme of legal service provision for survivors. So we're hoping that others will either use the conceptual model or share more of how they're doing it so we can put it in conversation with this model if you're in a different bucket. So someone asked, Chris, what are the legal clinics who are participating?
Oh, thank you. I can now see the chat box, and I was about to type it in, but we had a poll come up. Yes, we're working with the Arizona Voice for Crime Victims. We're working with the Maryland Crime Victim Resource Center, and with the, I'm going to get the acronym wrong here, Oregon Crime Victim Law Center.
Correct. Yep. Great.
I always have to think twice about Oregon's acronym for some reason.
So remember, folks, you can still enter your questions even though the poll is up. Just click on that chat arrow and the chat box will pop back up. I want to use this opportunity to revisit something that came up earlier, and Meg, you did address this a bit in chat, but one of our participants wanted to know whether we planned to define terms such as fair and just for the clients, or do you let the client define it subjectively, and how does that sort of thing work in this context? And Meg, I'll start with you because you addressed this in chat.
Yeah, so the model, as well as the way we do our work, and I think all of the pilots do their work, is it's really client-driven. So it is and survivor-led, client-driven, and so it's perceptions of fairness, of justice, right, which comes right out of procedural justice theory also, right? Those are about perception. And so that's the model as we understand it, so Chris can correct me if I'm wrong, but it is really victim survivor-led, and then similarly it would be community-led, right? Systems, you might be able to have some assessments that are not perception-based, but when it comes to justice and fairness and fair treatment, the survivor-led assessment, assuming that you have put in place through trauma-informed advocacy, understanding of what the options of treatment are, right, so that they aren't being told, you know, you get water or nothing, right, and then, well, I got water, so it must be fair, right? You have to have something behind it that allows them to understand the spectrum of possibilities, and then, but then perception-led, survivor-led assessment.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I'm noticing that we are at 3 o'clock right now, so I wanted to put up this final slide here about where you can get more information. We have first developed a 2-page fact sheet, which just gives a quick at-a-glance view of the conceptual model and presents the more high-level simplified version of it. And we also have a project web page that can be accessed at the URL that's on your screen that gives quite a lot of project information. It also has a link to the fact sheet. It has a link also to a full-length report that details the whole process that we went through in developing the conceptual model, and also contains more detailed explanations of all of the items in there. That's available on the website there for you. When the recording of the webinar is ready, that will also be up on the website, and we'll be sending you a follow-up email in a few days, not only with these links and a link to the recording of the webinar, but possibly a couple of other resources as well. And we're just so thankful that you are all here with us today.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, Chris, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Jason, if you can advance to the last slide that Chris was talking about.
Oh, no. Yeah, that last slide was a bonus slide there. The one with the link is the blue slide.
All right, thanks so much. Chris, we did have one final comment that someone is concerned about the linkages between victim services and long-term outcomes because there are so many other variables that impact an individual's journey. And I know that the advisory group talked about this a lot, and that this does come up when you're trying to measure outcomes, and you know that to fully meet the needs of survivors, you have to network with a lot of different providers, and that there are a lot of different considerations that come into play. Do you or Meg want to talk about that?
I mean, I could just jump in briefly at this point, especially with regards to the long-term objectives. I think that that's absolutely an important point to make, in that victim legal services may contribute to those long-term objectives, but there are so many more factors in play, absolutely, and that would need to be taken into account in any evaluation designed based on this. We also had outcomes related to partnerships and networks as well that acknowledge that.
And I will just, just briefly, I mean, I'm not a researcher, so figuring that out, I leave to the researchers, but certainly, right, causation is complex and correlation might be the best we can get to. That said, there was no one in the advisory group that thought that legal services standing alone could achieve those outcomes and objectives, that it is part of a holistic service provision. And what we are hoping to get to, I mean, it'd be great to get to causation, but it would be, if we can get to correlation, that would be lovely too.
All right, well, no other questions are coming in. I want to thank both of you for such a terrific conversation today, and thanks to all of the participants for really having an active chat and really engaging. Your comments are really going to inform this project, and we hope that you'll follow along as this project continues. Watch our progress and learn how you can apply this, this conceptual model to your own work. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.